The autumn wind carried the scent of sage and cattle across the Whitehorse Ranch as I watched my youngest son Danny ride toward Devil's Canyon with murder in his heart. My name is Rebecca Whitehorse, and at 58 years old, I thought I knew every shadow that crossed my family's land. I was wrong. 3 days ago, Danny and his wife Clara pushed my husband Sam and me off that very canyon, expecting the rocks below to silence us forever. As I lay broken and bleeding, Sam's desperate whisper saved our lives. Pretend we're dead. But that wasn't the worst revelation. The worst was learning that our son had already killed once before his own brother Thomas, 5 years ago, in the unforgiving Texas frontier of 1883, where justice rides slower than vengeance. I discovered that the greatest danger to a family doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it comes from within, wearing the face of your own blood. This story changed everything I believed about family, trust, and survival on the frontier. If you've ever wondered how far a mother's love can be tested, or how justice finds its way in the lawless territories of the Old West, then you need to hear what happened next. The truth about frontier families, cultural survival, and the price of land in 1880s Texas will shake you to your core. Share this story with someone who understands that the strongest bonds can sometimes become the most dangerous betrayals. Subscribe for more untold stories from the American frontier, where survival depended on knowing who you could trust. The morning I found blood on Danny's saddle was the morning everything changed, though I wouldn't understand the true horror of that discovery until 3 days later when my own son pushed me off Devil's Canyon to silence me forever. My name is Rebecca Whitehorse, and at 58 years old, I thought I knew every shadow that crossed my family's land. The blood of two peoples flows through my veins. My mother was Comanche, my father a German settler who fell in love with her fierce spirit. That mixed heritage has been both blessing and burden in the harsh Texas frontier of 1883, where trust can mean the difference between life and death. I stepped onto the wooden porch of our adobe house as dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. The October air carried the scent of mesquite and the distant lowing of cattle, but underneath it all, I caught something else, the metallic smell of blood that made my Comanche instincts scream danger. Morning. My heart. Sam's voice came from behind me, warm with 35 years of love. My husband emerged from the house, his graying hair tousled from sleep, already dressed for another day of ranch work. At 62, Sam Whitehorse was still the strongest man I knew, but lately I'd noticed new lines of worry etched around his eyes. Something's wrong, I said, turning to face him. I can smell blood on the morning wind. Sam's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 at his hip, the gesture of a man who'd served as deputy sheriff long enough to know that trouble often came with the sunrise. Where? Before I could answer, Yanani, our eldest son Thomas, appeared around the corner of the house, leading his horse. At 32, he had his father's steady nature and my mother's keen eyes that missed nothing. But this morning, those eyes were troubled. Ma, Pa, he said, removing his hat. I found something strange in the barn. Danny's saddle, there's blood on the leather, and it's fresh. The words hit me like a physical blow. My youngest son had been acting strange for months, ever since his marriage to Clara, a pretty blonde woman from back east whose sweet smile never quite reached her calculating eyes. But blood on his saddle meant something far worse than the moodiness I'd attributed to his failed prospecting ventures. Where is Danny? Sam asked, his voice taking on the hard edge he used when wearing his deputy's badge. Still as I moved to the stove where coffee boiled and cornbread baked, but my hands shook as I poured the dark liquid into tin cups. From my medicine pouch, I added dried sage and sweet grass, herbs my Uncle Chief Running Bear had given me for protection and clear thinking. This morning, I had a terrible feeling we'd need both. Here Sam accepted his cup, understanding the gravity in my voice. He'd learned long ago to respect the wisdom of my mother's people, especially when danger threatened our family. Thomas took his coffee but kept glancing toward the house, as if expecting his brother to appear at any moment. The kitchen door opened with a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. Danny stepped inside, and I had to suppress a gasp at his appearance. His clothes were rumpled and stained, his dark hair disheveled, and there were scratches on his hands that looked suspiciously fresh. But it was his eyes that chilled me most. They held a wildness I'd never seen before, like those of a cornered animal. Morning, he mumbled, avoiding our gazes as he reached for the coffee pot. Danny, Sam said carefully, Thomas found blood on your saddle. You want to explain that? My youngest son's hand froze halfway to the coffee pot. For a heartbeat. The kitchen was silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Then Danny straightened, and when he turned to face us, I saw something in his expression that made my blood run cold. Not guilt or shame, but calculation. "Cut my hand yesterday fixing fence," he said, holding up his scratched palm. "Must have dripped on the leather." It was a lie. Every instinct inherited from my Comanche mother screamed that it was a lie. Those scratches were too fresh, too numerous, and they looked more like defensive wounds than cuts from barbed wire. But before I could voice my suspicions, Thomas spoke. "Funny thing about that fence," my eldest son said quietly. "I rode that section yesterday morning. All the posts were solid, no repairs needed." Danny's face flushed red, then white. His hand moved unconsciously toward his hip, where I noticed for the first time that he was wearing his gun, unusual for morning chores around the ranch. "You calling me a liar, brother?" Danny's voice carried a dangerous edge that made Sam step closer to Thomas. "I'm asking for the truth," Thomas replied steadily. "Something's been eating at you for months. Danny, maybe it's time you told us what's really wrong." For a moment, I thought Danny might confess whatever terrible thing was weighing on his soul. His face crumpled, and he looked so much like the little boy who used to cry in my arms after nightmares. But then his expression hardened again, and I saw a flash of something that terrified me, the cold, calculating look of a man who'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "Nothing's wrong," he said through gritted teeth. "Nothing that won't be fixed real soon." He turned and walked out, leaving the door standing open behind him. Through the doorway, I watched him stride toward the barn with the purposeful gait of a man who'd made a decision. A terrible, final decision. "Sam," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "I think our son is in more trouble than we know. My husband's weathered hand found mine, and I felt him trembling. I know. Rebecca, God help us. I think I know." Outside, I heard Danny saddling his horse, the leather creaking in the morning stillness, and on the wind that carried the scent of sage and cattle, I caught another smell, the smell of fresh turned earth and something else. Something that reminded me of the stories my mother used to tell about the spirits of the dead who couldn't rest until justice was done. As Danny rode away toward Devil's Canyon, I pressed my hand to my heart and felt the rapid beating that told me our family was about to face its darkest hour. Saturday morning brought the weekly market to Cedar Creek, our small frontier town that served as the heart of our scattered ranching community. Despite my growing fears about Danny, I forced myself to maintain our family's routine, in a place where survival depended on community bonds. Showing weakness could be as dangerous as showing your back to a rattlesnake. Sam hitched our wagon while I gathered the goods we'd trade: fresh eggs, my hand-woven blankets, and small leather pouches of the healing herbs my Uncle Chief Running Bear had taught me to prepare. The Comanche knowledge passed down through my mother's line had made me the unofficial healer for families within a day's ride, and that reputation was worth more than gold in establishing trust. "You sure you're up for this today?" Sam asked, helping me into the wagon seat. The morning's discovery had shaken us both, but 35 years of marriage had taught us to present a united front to the world, no matter what storms raged at home. "We need to show our faces," I replied, smoothing my best calico dress, the blue one with tiny white flowers that Sam had bought me from a traveling merchant last spring. "People will talk if we don't come, especially with Danny acting so strange lately." The ride into town took 40 minutes across rolling hills dotted with mesquite and live oak. Other wagons converged on the same dusty main street, filled with ranching families who looked forward to this weekly gathering as much for the social connection as the commerce, in a territory where your nearest neighbor might be 5 miles away. Market day was when we came together as a community. Cedar Creek's main street bustled with activity. Wooden stalls lined both sides, displaying everything from hand-forged horseshoes to bolts of cloth brought by wagon train from San Antonio. The air filled with the sounds of haggling, children laughing, and the occasional bellow from cattle being driven through to the stockyards at the far end of town. Rebecca called out Martha Henderson, the banker's wife, waving from her stall of preserved fruits. "I was hoping you'd come today. My youngest has been coughing something terrible, and Doc Miller says there's nothing more he can do." I climbed down from our wagon, grateful for the familiar routine of helping others. "Bring him by this afternoon," I said, pulling a small leather pouch from my basket. "This is willow bark and honey. Have him drink it as tea 3 times daily. The old ways say it will ease the cough and bring restful sleep." Martha's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Bless you, Rebecca. How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," I replied. As always, my mother had taught me that healing was a gift from the spirits, not something to be sold. Just remember to say a prayer of thanks to the 4 directions when the boy recovers. As Martha hurried away clutching the medicine, I felt a familiar warmth in my chest. This was why Sam and I had chosen to stay in this harsh country rather than move back east where life might be easier. Here, we were part of something larger than ourselves, a community where Anglo and Mexican and the few remaining Comanche families worked together for survival. Mrs. Whitehorse. A young voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned to see Jenny Morrison, Sheriff Jake Morrison's 16-year-old daughter, approaching with shy steps. My pa sent me to ask if you'd take a look at something. I followed Jenny to where Sheriff Morrison stood examining a display of silver jewelry spread on a blanket by a Mexican trader named Carlos Mendez. The pieces were beautiful, intricate work that spoke of old-world craftsmanship, but something about the sheriff's expression told me this wasn't a casual shopping expedition. "Rebecca," Sheriff Morrison said quietly. "Carlos here says a young man tried to sell him some silver pieces yesterday. The description matches your Danny. But the jewelry, well, it's mighty fine for a failed prospector to own." My heart sank as Carlos held up a delicate necklace set with turquoise stones. The workmanship was exquisite, far beyond anything Danny could afford on his own, and certainly not something he'd mentioned finding during his prospecting attempts. The young man, he was very nervous, Carlos said in his careful English. He wanted to sell quickly, for much less than the pieces are worth. I told him I needed time to examine them properly, but he became angry and left. Sheriff Morrison's weathered face showed the concern of a lawman who'd learned to read the signs of trouble. "Rebecca, I don't want to pry into family business, but if Danny's come into possession of valuable items he can't account for." "I understand." "Jake," I said, though my voice sounded strained even to my own ears. "We'll talk to him." As we walked away from Carlos's stall, I caught sight of a familiar figure across the street. My uncle, Chief Running Bear, stood in the shadow of the general store, his dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. At 65, he moved with the silent grace of a man who'd spent his youth as a Comanche warrior, and his presence in town always drew stares from the Anglo families who still remembered the old conflicts. I excused myself from Sam and crossed to meet my uncle. He wore his usual mixture of traditional and white man's clothing, buckskin leggings beneath a cotton shirt, his long gray hair braided with feathers and beads that caught the morning light. "Niece," he said in the Comanche tongue, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "The spirits have been speaking to me of your family. Dark clouds gather over the Whitehorse name." "Uncle," I replied in the same language, grateful for the privacy it afforded us. "What have the spirits shown you?" His weathered hand touched my shoulder, and I felt the familiar tingle that came when he shared his visions. Blood calls to blood across the years. A death unavenged seeks justice, and the guilty one grows desperate. Beware the canyon where eagles nest. It will see more blood before the moon grows full again. Devil's Canyon. My blood turned cold as I remembered Danny riding in that direction after our confrontation at breakfast. "Uncle, is there more can you see?" "The spirits show only shadows and warnings," he interrupted. "But this I know, your family's greatest trial approaches. Trust in the old ways. Niece. When white man's law fails, the spirits will guide you to justice." Before I could ask more questions, he melted back into the crowd with the supernatural quiet that had made his people legendary. I stood there trembling, trying to process his warning, when Sam's voice called my name. "Rebecca, come see what Thomas found." I hurried back to our wagon where Thomas stood talking excitedly with Sam and several other ranchers. In his hands, he held a piece of paper that made my heart race, a bank notice of some kind. "Ma," Thomas said, his voice tight with concern. "I was talking to Mr. Peterson about cattle prices when he mentioned something strange. Someone's been asking questions about our ranch, specifically about how much it might be worth if it were sold." "Who's been asking?" I demanded, though I feared I already knew the answer. Peterson wouldn't say directly, but he hinted it was someone from our own family. Thomas replied. "Someone who seemed mighty interested in knowing exactly what our land and cattle would bring at market." The pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. Danny's strange behavior, the blood on his saddle, the silver jewelry he'd tried to sell, and now questions about the ranch's value. Whatever trouble my youngest son had gotten himself into, it was bigger than I'd imagined. "There's more," Sam said grimly. "I talked to the bank president. Someone forged my signature on a loan application last month, tried to borrow against the ranch without our knowledge. The world seemed to spin around me as the full scope of Danny's deception became clear. He wasn't just in trouble, he was actively working against his own family, planning something that would require access to our life's work. As we loaded our wagon to head home, I caught sight of Danny and Clara near the saloon, deep in conversation with a group of rough-looking men I didn't recognize. The way they huddled together, constantly looking over their shoulders, told me everything I needed to know. My son wasn't just in trouble. He was the trouble. And whatever he was planning would destroy everything Sam and I had built over 3 decades of backbreaking work. The ride home passed in tense silence, each of us lost in our own dark thoughts. But as we crested the hill that overlooked our ranch, I made a silent vow to the spirits of my ancestors whatever Danny was planning, I would be ready for him. That evening, as the shadows lengthened across our ranch and the cattle settled for the night, I finally confronted my husband with the question that had been burning in my heart since Chief Running Bear's warning about blood calling to blood across the years. "Sam," I said as we sat on our porch watching the first stars appear, "tell me the truth about how Thomas died." My husband's weathered hands stilled on the coffee cup he'd been holding, and in the lamplight spilling from our kitchen window, I saw his face go pale as bleached bone. For 5 years, I'd accepted the story of Thomas falling from his horse while checking cattle near Devil's Canyon. For 5 years, I'd grieved my eldest son as the victim of a tragic accident, but Chief Running Bear's words about a death unavenged had planted a seed of terrible suspicion. "Rebecca," Sam said quietly, "some truths are better left buried." "No." My voice carried the steel that my Comanche mother had passed down to me. "Not when our surviving son is plotting against us. Not when the spirits are warning of blood and betrayal. I need to know what really happened to Thomas." Sam set down his coffee cup with shaking hands and stared out at the darkness that had swallowed Devil's Canyon. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low I had to lean forward to hear him. "It wasn't an accident. Rebecca, God forgive me. It wasn't an accident." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. I'd suspected, but hearing the confirmation was like having my heart torn from my chest. What happened? Sam's shoulders sagged as if the weight of 5 years' worth of lies was finally crushing him. "The night Thomas died, I couldn't sleep. Something had been bothering me for weeks. Money missing from our accounts. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. I had started to suspect Danny, but I needed proof before I accused my own son. Shabuas ifdi." I remembered that time. How distracted Sam had been. How he'd spent long hours going over our financial records with a frown creasing his brow. I'd attributed it to the usual worries of ranch life, never imagining the betrayal that was eating at him. "I saw Danny leave the house around sunset," Sam continued. "He was carrying something, papers of some kind, and he had that look he gets when he's up to no good, so I followed him. To Devil's Canyon." Sam nodded, his eyes haunted by memories he'd tried to bury. Thomas was already there, waiting. I could hear them arguing before I got close enough to see them clearly. Thomas was waving bank statements, shouting about theft and betrayal. Danny was denying everything, but his voice had that desperate edge it gets when he's cornered. I closed my eyes and trying to imagine my 2 sons facing each other in anger while their father watched from the shadows. The image made my heart ache with a pain so deep it felt like dying. "What were they fighting about exactly?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Thomas had discovered that Danny had been forging our signatures on bank drafts," Sam said. "Small amounts at first, $20, $30. But over the past year, it had grown to nearly $300. Thomas had been investigating for months, gathering evidence. $300. In 1878, that was more money than most ranch hands saw in 2 years. It was enough to buy cattle, land, or passage back east for a new start. It was also enough to kill for, apparently. Thomas gave Danny an ultimatum. Sam continued, his voice breaking. "Return the money and confess to us, or Thomas would turn him over to Sheriff Morrison himself. He said he wouldn't let Danny destroy everything we'd worked for." And Danny's response, Sam's hands clenched into fists. He laughed. "Rebecca." He actually laughed and said Thomas had always been the golden boy, always the favorite, and always standing in his way. He said it was time for things to change, time for him to get what he deserved. The hatred in my youngest son's words, even filtered through Sam's retelling, chilled me to the bone. I'd known there was rivalry between my boys, but I'd never imagined it ran so deep. So poisonous. Then what happened? I whispered. Thomas turned to walk away. Said he was going to the sheriff first thing in the morning. That's when Danny. Sam's voice failed him completely, and I saw tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Tell me, I said, though every fiber of my being wanted to stop him, wanted to preserve the illusion that my son was merely troubled, not a killer. Danny picked up a rock, a big one, and hit Thomas in the back of the head. Thomas went down hard, didn't even cry out. Then Danny rolled him to the edge of the canyon and pushed him over. The world spun around me as the full horror of what Sam was describing sank in. My baby, my youngest son, had murdered his own brother in cold blood, not in a moment of passion or self-defense, but as a calculated act to protect his theft and secure his position as our only heir. You saw all this, I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Every terrible second of it. Sam confirmed. I was frozen, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I kept thinking it couldn't be real, that I was having some kind of nightmare. But you didn't stop him. You didn't arrest him. Sam flinched as if I'd struck him. By the time I could move, it was too late. Thomas was already dead, and Danny was standing there shaking and crying, looking like a lost child. He saw me coming and fell to his knees, begging me to help him. I could picture the scene too clearly, Danny playing on his father's love, manipulating Sam's protective instincts even in the aftermath of murder. What did he say? That it was an accident, that he'd only meant to scare Thomas, that the rock had slipped from his hand. He swore he'd never meant for anyone to get hurt, that he was just desperate and scared about the money he'd taken. And you believed him? Sam shook his head miserably. No, I saw what really happened, but he was my son, Rebecca. My baby boy was standing there covered in his brother's blood, begging me to save him. How could I turn him over to the law? The anguish in my husband's voice broke my heart, but it also filled me with a cold fury. So you helped him cover it up. We staged the scene to look like Thomas had fallen from his horse. Danny knew where Thomas had been planning to check the cattle, so we moved the body there and scattered some loose rocks to make it look like a landslide had spooked his horse. And the money, Danny swore he'd pay it back, that he'd learned his lesson, that he'd never steal again. He promised he'd be the son we needed him to be. I laughed bitterly. And instead, he's been stealing from us ever since, hasn't he? That's why you've been so careful with the books. So secretive about our finances. Sam nodded in defeat. Every month, more money disappears. Every month. I tell myself this will be the last time. But I can't confront him because that would mean admitting I helped cover up Thomas's murder. The full scope of the trap my husband had walked into became clear. By protecting Danny from justice, Sam had made himself an accessory to murder. Every day since Thomas's death, he'd been living with the knowledge that he'd chosen one son over another, chosen the killer over the victim. There's more, isn't there? I asked, reading the continued anguish in his expression. Last week, I discovered that Danny's been forging documents to try to gain access to our land deeds. He's not just stealing money anymore. Rebecca, he's planning to take everything, the ranch, the cattle, everything we've built. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Danny hadn't just killed Thomas to cover up his theft. He'd killed him to eliminate the only person who stood between him and our entire inheritance. And now, with Thomas gone and his parents growing older, he was positioning himself to take it all. The men he was talking to at the market, I said, remembering the rough-looking strangers. They're not just friends, are they? Sam shook his head grimly. I think they're the men he owes money to. I've been asking around discreetly. And word is that Danny's been gambling heavily in the saloons in San Antonio. He owes some very dangerous people a lot of money. How much, near as I can tell? Close to $1,000. $1,000. More than our ranch made in a good year. More than we had in savings. The kind of debt that got men killed on the frontier, where a man's word was his bond and defaulting on gambling debts was considered worse than horse theft. So he needs our ranch to pay his debts, I said, understanding flooding through me. And we're the only thing standing between him and ownership. I think so, Sam agreed. And I think he's getting desperate enough to do something about it. As if summoned by our conversation, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the darkness. Danny was returning from whatever business had kept him in town. And for the first time in my life, I was afraid of my own son. What are we going to do? I asked. Sam reached over and took my hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with mine. I don't know. Rebecca, God help me, I just don't know. But as I sat there in the darkness, listening to my son's horse approaching our house, I felt something cold and hard settling in my chest. Danny had killed Thomas. He'd been stealing from us for years, and now he was planning to take everything we'd worked for. The spirits of my ancestors whispered in the wind, reminding me that sometimes, when white man's law failed, older forms of justice had to suffice. The next morning, I rode alone to the sacred grove where my uncle Chief Running Bear held council with the spirits. The cottonwoods along Willow Creek had been a meeting place for the Comanche for generations, and even now, with most of the tribe scattered to reservations, the old ways still held power here. I found him sitting cross-legged beside the creek, his weathered hands weaving sweetgrass into braids while he chanted in the ancient tongue. Smoke from his sacred fire carried prayers to the four directions, and the morning air shimmered with spiritual energy that made my skin tingle with recognition. "Uncle," I said in Comanche, dismounting and approaching with the respect due to an elder, "I need your guidance. The darkness you warned of has revealed itself." Chief Running Bear's dark eyes opened, and I saw in them the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "Sit, daughter of my sister. The spirits have been showing me visions of your family's trial. Blood has indeed called to blood across the years." I settled beside him on the soft grass, accepting the bundle of sage he offered me. As the smoke curled around us, I felt the presence of my ancestors, warrior women who had faced impossible choices and found the strength to survive. "Tell me what you have learned," he said simply. In halting Comanche mixed with English when the old language failed me, I told him everything: Thomas's murder, Sam's terrible choice to protect Danny, the years of theft and lies that had followed. My uncle listened without judgment, occasionally nodding as if the spirits had already whispered these truths to him. "And now," he asked when I finished, "now Danny grows desperate. His gambling debts threaten to destroy everything we've built, and I fear he plans to silence Sam and me permanently to claim our inheritance." Chief Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames of his sacred fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of generations of tribal wisdom. "In the old days, when a warrior brought dishonor to his family through murder and theft, the tribal council would decide his fate, but you live in two worlds now, niece. The white man's law has failed you, and the old justice seems beyond reach. What would the tribal council have done, banishment or death, depending on the severity of the crimes? Murder of kin was considered the worst possible betrayal. It poisoned the spiritual bonds that held the tribe together." I shivered despite the warmth of the morning sun. "Is there no other way he is still my son? A mother's love is sacred," my uncle acknowledged, "but so is justice for the innocent dead. Your eldest son's spirit cannot rest while his killer walks free, growing fat on the fruits of his crime." As if summoned by his words, I felt a presence beside me, not visible, but unmistakably Thomas. The sensation was so strong that I turned, half expecting to see him standing there with his gentle smile and honest eyes. Instead, I saw only the empty air, but the feeling of his presence remained. "He is here," Chief Running Bear said softly. "The murdered dead often linger near those they loved, seeking justice or warning of continued danger." Tears streamed down my cheeks as I whispered, "Thomas, I'm so sorry. I should have known, should have protected you." The presence seemed to wrap around me like an embrace, offering forgiveness and comfort. But underneath that love, I sensed an urgency, a warning that time was running short. "Uncle, what should I do?" "Prepare yourself for what is coming," he replied. "The spirits show me a great confrontation approaching, a test that will determine whether justice or evil triumphs in your family. You must be ready to choose between a mother's love and a warrior's duty." Before I could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching horses interrupted our council. Through the trees, I saw two riders heading toward our ranch, strangers whose hard faces and heavy gun belts marked them as the kind of men who collected debts with violence. "The wolves circle," Chief Running Bear observed grimly. "Your son's creditors grow impatient." I mounted my horse and rode hard for home, arriving just as the two men dismounted in our front yard. Sam emerged from the barn, his hand resting casually on his gun butt, the gesture of a man who recognized danger. "Help you, gentlemen?" Sam asked, his deputy sheriff's training evident in his calm demeanor despite the threat these men represented. The taller of the two, a lean man with cold blue eyes and a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, stepped forward. "We're looking for Danny Whitehorse. He owes our boss money, and the payment's overdue." "Danny's not here," Sam replied truthfully. Our son had ridden out before dawn, claiming he was checking the cattle in the north pasture. "When do you expect him back?" the second man asked. He was shorter but broader, with the thick hands of a man who enjoyed inflicting pain. "Hard to say," Sam said. "Ranch work keeps a man busy." The scarred man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Maybe you don't understand the situation, old man. Your boy owes our boss $1,500. That's a lot of money for a failed prospector to come up with. $1,500. Even more than Sam had estimated, and far more than we could possibly pay even if we sold everything we owned." "I'm sure there's been some mistake," I said, stepping forward from where I'd been listening near the corner of the house. "Danny's never mentioned any debts." Both men turned to look at me, and I saw the calculating way they assessed my appearance, my clothes, the obvious prosperity of our ranch. They were estimating our worth, determining how much pressure they could apply. "No mistake, ma'am," the scarred man said with mock politeness. "Your boy's been playing cards in San Antonio for months, living high on borrowed money. Our boss was patient at first, but patience has limits." "What exactly are you saying?" Sam asked, though I could see in his eyes that he already knew. "We're saying that if Danny can't pay what he owes, we'll have to look to his family for satisfaction. Nice ranch you got here. Bet it's worth quite a bit." The threat was clear, and perfectly legal under frontier justice. A man's debts became his family's responsibility, especially when that family had obvious assets to cover the obligation. "How long do we have?" I asked, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "1 week," the shorter man replied. 7 days to come up with the money, or we start taking payment in other ways." After they left, Sam and I stood in our yard feeling the weight of impossible choices. We couldn't raise $1,500 without selling the ranch, but selling would leave us with nothing after 30 years of backbreaking work. And even if we could somehow find the money, it would only enable Danny's continued gambling and theft. "There's something else," Sam said quietly. "While you were gone, Clara came by. She wanted to know if we'd made our wills yet. Said it was important for family planning." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Clara wasn't just Danny's wife, she was his accomplice, helping to plan our destruction. Her sweet smiles and affectionate hugs had been a mask hiding the same cold calculation that drove her husband. "She knows about the debts," I realized. "She's been encouraging Danny's gambling, knowing it would force us into an impossible situation." "I think you're right," Sam agreed, "and I think they've already decided how to solve their problem." That evening, as we sat on our porch watching the sunset paint Devil's Canyon in shades of red and gold, I made a decision that would have horrified the woman I'd been just a week ago. "Sam," I said quietly, "if they come for us, I won't go quietly." My husband looked at me with surprise, then understanding. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that sometimes a mother has to choose between saving her child and saving her family. And I'm thinking that Chief Running Bear was right. Some forms of justice are older than white man's law." In the distance, a coyote howled, and I heard in that sound the voices of my warrior ancestors calling me to remember that survival sometimes required terrible choices. The spirits had warned me that a great confrontation was coming. Now I understood that when it arrived, I would have to decide whether I was Rebecca, the grieving mother, or Rebecca, the Comanche warrior's daughter. The choice would determine not just my survival, but whether justice would finally come for my murdered son. 3 days after the creditor's visit, Danny finally returned home with Clara at his side and a smile that chilled my blood. They arrived at sunset, their horses lathered with sweat as if they'd been riding hard, and there was something in their manner that set every instinct inherited from my warrior ancestors screaming with alarm. "Ma! Pa!" Danny called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying a false cheerfulness that made my skin crawl. "Clara and I have been talking, and we realized we've been neglecting family lately. We want to make it up to you." Clara slid gracefully from her side saddle, her blonde hair catching the last rays of sunlight. She wore her prettiest dress, the green one with tiny white flowers, and her smile was radiant as she approached me with open arms. "Mother Rebecca," she said, embracing me with what felt like genuine warmth. "I've been such a terrible daughter-in-law, staying away when I should have been helping you with the household duties." The endearment Mother Rebecca had once pleased me, but now it sounded like mockery. I returned her embrace stiffly, noting how her eyes constantly moved, cataloging our possessions with the calculating gaze of someone taking inventory. "We've been worried about you," Sam said carefully, his hand resting near his gun belt. "Those men who came by looking for you seemed mighty serious about collecting what they're owed." For just a moment, Danny's mask slipped, and I saw a flash of the desperate fear that was driving him. But he recovered quickly, waving his hand as if dismissing a minor inconvenience. "That's all taken care of. Pa, I worked out a payment plan with them. Nothing for you to worry about." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that if I hadn't seen the creditors myself, I might have believed him. But I'd learned to read the signs of my son's deception, and everything about his manner screamed that he was planning something terrible. "That's wonderful news," I said, forcing warmth into my voice. "How did you manage to arrange that?" Clara stepped forward, linking her arm through Danny's with the practiced ease of a woman used to supporting her husband's lies. "Danny's been working on a business opportunity that should pay off very soon. The creditors agreed to wait once they understood the situation." "What kind of business opportunity?" Sam asked, his deputy sheriff instincts clearly aroused by their evasive answers. "Cattle speculation," Danny replied quickly. "There's a buyer in San Antonio willing to pay premium prices for quality stock. I just need to put together the right herd." Another lie. "We kept careful track of our cattle, and Danny knew better than anyone that we didn't have surplus stock to sell. Whatever he was planning, it didn't involve legitimate business." "Well," Clara said brightly, "that's not why we came tonight. Danny and I were talking about how long it's been since we've spent quality time together as a family. We thought it would be lovely to celebrate your upcoming anniversary with something special." My blood turned to ice. Our 36th wedding anniversary was next week, but we hadn't mentioned it to anyone. The fact that Clara knew the date meant she'd been paying closer attention to our personal affairs than any normal daughter-in-law would. "What did you have in mind?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Danny's eyes lit up with what looked like genuine enthusiasm, but I now recognized as the excitement of a predator closing in on prey. A family outing to Devil's Canyon. Clara's never seen the view from Eagle's Point, and I thought it would be perfect for taking photographs to commemorate the occasion. Devil's Canyon, the same place where he'd murdered Thomas 5 years ago, where Chief Running Bear had warned me more blood would be spilled before the moon grew full. The location wasn't coincidental. It was chosen with the cold calculation of a man who'd killed before and planned to kill again. "That's very thoughtful," Sam said slowly, "but your mother and I aren't as young as we used to be. That's a difficult climb for folks our age." "Nonsense," Clara interjected with a laugh that sounded like silver bells hiding steel beneath. "You're both strong and healthy. Besides, Danny and I will be there to help if you need it. We'll bring ropes and safety equipment to make sure everyone stays secure." The word secure sent a chill down my spine. In their mouths, it sounded more like a threat than a promise of protection. "When were you thinking of going?" I asked. "Buying time to think. This Saturday," Danny replied. "The weather's supposed to be perfect, and we could make a whole day of it. Pack a picnic. Take plenty of photographs. Really celebrate your anniversary properly." See, Saturday was 4 days away, exactly 3 days before the creditor's deadline. If Sam and I disappeared in a tragic accident at Devil's Canyon, Danny would inherit everything just in time to pay his debts and start fresh. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. "It sounds lovely," I said, forcing a smile. "We'd be honored to spend our anniversary with you." Clara clapped her hands together with apparent delight. "Wonderful, I'll pack a special picnic basket, and Danny will bring his new camera. We'll capture memories that will last forever." The irony of her words, memories that would last forever for people who wouldn't survive to remember them, made my stomach turn. But I kept my expression pleasant, playing the role of the trusting mother-in-law while my mind raced with plans of my own. After they left, promising to return Saturday morning with supplies for our celebration, Sam and I sat in our kitchen in heavy silence. The weight of what we'd just agreed to pressed down on us like a physical burden. "They're going to kill us," Sam said quietly, "just like Danny killed Thomas." "I know," I replied, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Sam looked at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Rebecca, I know that look. You're planning something." "I'm planning to survive," I said firmly, "and I'm planning to make sure that Thomas finally gets the justice he deserves." That night, I made careful preparations. I cleaned and loaded my father's old Colt revolver, the one he'd carried during his scouting days. I packed a small bag with medical supplies, including the herbs Chief Running Bear had taught me to use for pain and healing. Most importantly, I wrote a detailed letter explaining everything we'd discovered about Danny's crimes, sealing it in an envelope addressed to Sheriff Morrison. "If we don't come back from Devil's Canyon," I told Sam as I hid the letter in our bedroom, "at least someone will know the truth." But even as I made these practical preparations, another part of my mind was working on a different kind of plan. Chief Running Bear had said I would have to choose between a mother's love and a warrior's duty. I thought that meant choosing whether to turn Danny over to the law or protect him from justice. Now I understood that the choice was far more fundamental. It was between dying as victims of our son's betrayal or surviving as instruments of ancient justice. The spirits of my ancestors whispered in the darkness, reminding me that Comanche warriors never went quietly into death. They fought with cunning and courage, using every advantage the land and their enemies' overconfidence could provide. Danny thought he was leading us to our deaths at Devil's Canyon. He had no idea he was walking into a trap set by a woman who carried the blood of warriors in her veins and the rage of a mother whose child had been murdered. Saturday couldn't come soon enough. It was time for the final confrontation. And this time, justice would not be denied. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt Thomas's presence beside me one last time, and in that ghostly touch, I sensed approval and the promise that his spirit would guide my hand when the moment of reckoning arrived. The hunt was about to begin, and this time, the predator would become the prey. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering over Devil's Canyon like an omen of the violence to come. I rose before sunrise and made my way to the sacred grove where Chief Running Bear had counseled me, carrying offerings of tobacco and sweetgrass for the spirits of my ancestors. The ritual preparation was as important as the physical planning. In the old ways, a warrior never went into battle without seeking the guidance and protection of those who had fought before. I needed their strength, their cunning, and their courage for what lay ahead. As smoke from the sacred fire carried my prayers to the four directions, I felt the presence of my warrior grandmother, White Dove, who had fought beside the great chiefs against the cavalry. Her spirit whispered tactics in the ancient tongue, how to use the land as an ally, how to turn an enemy's confidence into weakness, how to strike when they least expected it. Give me the strength to do what must be done. I prayed in Comanche. Help me protect my family and bring justice to my murdered son. The wind through the cottonwoods sounded like voices answering, promising that I would not face this trial alone. When I returned to the ranch, Sam was waiting with coffee and a grim expression that told me he'd been thinking as hard as I had about our desperate situation. "I've been considering our options," he said as we sat at our kitchen table, speaking in low voices even though we were alone. "We could run, pack what we can carry, and head for California or Oregon Territory. Start over somewhere Danny can't find us." I shook my head firmly. Running would mean abandoning everything we've built, and it wouldn't bring Thomas justice. Besides, Danny's creditors would just follow us. Men like that don't give up easily. Then we go to Sheriff Morrison, tell him everything, and let the law handle it. "With what evidence?" I asked. "Your word against Danny's about something that happened 5 years ago, and even if Morrison believed us, it would mean you'd go to prison as an accessory to murder." Sam's shoulders sagged as he acknowledged the truth of my words. The choice to protect Danny after Thomas's death had trapped us in a web of complicity that made seeking legal justice nearly impossible. "So what do you propose?" he asked. I leaned forward, lowering my voice to barely above a whisper. "We go to Devil's Canyon as planned, but we go prepared. We turn their trap into our advantage." "How?" I spread a piece of paper on the table and began sketching the canyon's layout from memory. "Danny chose Eagle's Point because it's isolated and the drop is fatal. But he's thinking like a white man. Direct confrontation. Overwhelming force. He doesn't understand that the canyon can be our ally if we use it properly." Sam studied my rough map, his deputy sheriff's training helping him see the tactical possibilities I was outlining. "You're thinking of the old Apache tricks your uncle taught you." "Exactly. The high ground isn't always the strongest position if your enemy knows the hidden paths. There's a ledge about 30 feet down from Eagle's Point, invisible from above, but accessible if you know where to look. My grandmother showed it to me when I was a child." "You're talking about deliberately falling off the cliff. I'm talking about appearing to fall while actually controlling our descent. If Danny thinks we're dead, he'll get careless. That's when we strike back." The plan was dangerous beyond measure, requiring split-second timing and absolute trust between us. But it had the advantage of using our enemies' expectations against them. Danny would be looking for fear and helplessness from his victims. not tactical thinking from trained fighters. We'll need supplies, Sam said, warming to the strategy. Rope, medical kit, weapons. Already gathered, I replied, gesturing toward a pack I'd prepared. But there's something else we need to consider. If we survive this, Danny and Clara can't be allowed to try again. This has to end at Devil's Canyon. One way or another. Sam met my eyes, and I saw in them the same cold determination that had settled in my own heart. You're talking about killing our own son. I'm talking about stopping a murderer who happens to share our blood. Danny killed Thomas, and he's planning to kill us. At what point does being his parents stop mattering more than protecting innocent lives? It was the hardest question I'd ever asked, but Sam didn't hesitate with his answer. When he chose murder over family, when he decided our lives were worth less than his gambling debts. We spent the rest of the morning in careful preparation. I sewed hidden pockets into our clothes to carry small knives and medical supplies. Sam checked and rechecked our weapons, making sure they were clean and loaded. We practiced the rope work we'd need for our controlled descent, using the barn loft to simulate the canyon conditions. Most importantly, we rehearsed our story. If anyone survived to tell what happened at Devil's Canyon, the official version needed to be believable. A tragic family outing turned deadly by accident, with Danny and Clara as the unfortunate victims of their own murderous plot gone wrong. The key is making it look like they fell first, I explained as we worked out the details. If their bodies are found at the bottom of the canyon with ours nowhere to be seen, it'll look like they were the victims and we were the survivors who went for help. And if someone asks how we survived when they didn't, we were lucky. They weren't. Sometimes that's all the explanation the world gets. That afternoon, I rode to town alone, ostensibly to buy supplies for our anniversary picnic, but actually to make final preparations. I deposited our detailed confession with the bank president, sealed in an envelope with instructions that it'd only be opened if Sam and I failed to return by Monday. I also had a quiet word with Doc Miller, the town physician who delivered both my sons and knew our family better than most. Doc, I said carefully, if something happens to Sam and me this weekend, I want you to know that Danny's been struggling with gambling debts. He owes some very dangerous men a lot of money. Doc Miller's weathered face creased with concern. Rebecca, are you in some kind of trouble? I hope not, I replied honestly. But if we don't come back from our anniversary outing, I wanted someone to know where to start looking for answers. That evening, as Sam and I sat on our porch watching the sun set behind Devil's Canyon, I felt the strange peace that comes before battle. The fear was still there, but it was controlled now, channeled into the cold focus my warrior ancestors had passed down through generations. Any regrets? Sam asked, taking my hand in his calloused grip. About Danny, no. He made his choices, and now we have to make ours. About Thomas only, that we didn't get justice for him sooner. And about us, 35 years of marriage ending like this. I squeezed his hand, feeling the strength that had sustained me through decades of frontier life. If we don't survive tomorrow, at least we'll die fighting together. That's more than most couples can say. In the distance, a coyote howled, and I heard in that sound the voices of my ancestors calling me to remember that sometimes the greatest act of love is the willingness to fight for those who can no longer fight for themselves. Saturday was less than 18 hours away. By sunset tomorrow, either justice would finally come to Devil's Canyon, or Sam and I would join Thomas in whatever realm awaited the spirits of the dead, but we wouldn't go quietly, and we wouldn't go unavenged. The blood of warriors flowed in my veins, and tomorrow, Danny would learn what that truly meant. Saturday morning arrived with deceptive beauty, clear skies, gentle breeze, and the kind of perfect autumn weather that made death seem impossible. I dressed carefully in my riding clothes, making sure the hidden knife was secure in my boot and the small medicine pouch was tucked safely inside my jacket. Every movement felt deliberate, weighted with the knowledge that this might be my last morning on Earth. Sam emerged from the barn leading our horses. His face composed, but his eyes holding the same grim determination that had sustained us through the night. We'd barely slept, spending the dark hours in final preparations and quiet conversation about what we hoped to accomplish if we survived. Ready? He asked simply. As ready as anyone can be for their own funeral, I replied, accepting his hand up into the saddle. Danny and Clara arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, their punctuality itself a sign of how carefully they'd planned this day. They came riding up our lane with smiles bright as summer sunshine. Clara carrying a wicker picnic basket, and Danny with a leather satchel that I suspected contained more than just photographic equipment. "Morning, Ma, Pa," Danny called out with the cheerful enthusiasm of a man anticipating a profitable day's work. Perfect weather for our anniversary celebration. Clara dismounted gracefully, her blonde hair pinned beneath a stylish hat that probably cost more than most ranch families saw in a month. "I packed all your favorite foods," she said, lifting the basket to show me its contents. "Fried chicken, biscuits, apple preserves, and that spice cake recipe you taught me." The domestic normalcy of the scene was almost surreal. Here was my son's wife, chatting about picnic food while planning to murder the woman who'd welcomed her into the family. The depths of her deception took my breath away. "You're very thoughtful, dear," I managed, forcing warmth into my voice. "This will be a day we'll never forget." If Clara caught the double meaning in my words, she gave no sign. Instead, she beamed with apparent pleasure and began securing the basket to her saddle with the efficient movements of someone who'd done this before. The ride to Devil's Canyon took an hour across rolling hills dotted with mesquite and live oak. Under different circumstances, it would have been pleasant, a family outing to one of the most scenic spots in our territory. But every mile brought us closer to the confrontation that would determine whether justice or evil triumphed. Danny rode ahead, playing the role of enthusiastic guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the canyon's history. His performance was flawless, but I noticed how his eyes constantly assessed the terrain, looking for the best approach to Eagle's Point and calculating sightlines for potential witnesses. "The Comanche used to camp in these hills," he said as we passed a grove of cottonwoods. "Ma's people, before they were moved to the reservation." "How fascinating," Clara replied with perfectly feigned interest. "It must have been so wild and dangerous then." "Still is," I said quietly, and this time I was certain Clara's smile flickered slightly. As we approached the canyon, I felt the presence of my ancestors growing stronger. The spirits of warriors who had fought and died defending this land seemed to whisper encouragement on the wind. My grandmother, White Dove, had told me that the canyon was a place of power, where the boundary between the living world and the spirit realm grew thin. Today, I would need all the help both worlds could provide. Devil's Canyon opened before us like a wound in the earth, a spectacular gorge carved by millennia of flash floods and wind erosion. The walls dropped nearly 200 feet to a rocky bottom where a thin stream wound between boulders the size of houses. Eagle's Point jutted out from the south rim, offering a commanding view of the entire canyon and the perfect location for what Danny had planned. "Magnificent," Clara breathed. And for once, her emotions seemed genuine. Even someone planning murder could appreciate the raw beauty of this place. We dismounted at the base of the trail that led to Eagle's Point, securing our horses to stunted oak trees that clung to the canyon rim. Danny immediately began unpacking his equipment, rope, camera, and what looked like surveying tools, but which I suspected had more sinister purposes. "The climb's a bit steep," he said, shouldering his pack, "but the view from the top is worth it. We'll get photographs that'll last forever." The irony of his words, photographs that would last forever to commemorate our deaths, made my stomach clench. But I forced myself to nod enthusiastically, playing my part in this deadly charade. The trail to Eagle's Point was treacherous, winding along narrow ledges with loose rock that shifted underfoot. Sam stayed close behind me, ready to catch me if I stumbled, while Danny and Clara moved with the sure-footed confidence of people who'd scouted this route before. Halfway up, I paused to catch my breath and survey the terrain below. The hidden ledge I'd told Sam about was invisible from this angle, just as I'd remembered. If our desperate plan worked, that narrow shelf of rock 30 feet down from the rim would be our salvation. "You doing all right, Ma?" Danny asked, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine concern. The performance was so convincing that for a moment I almost forgot he was planning to kill me. "Just need a minute," I replied. "These old bones aren't what they used to be." "Take all the time you need," Clara said sweetly. "We're in no hurry." But I could see in her eyes that she was calculating something, perhaps the best time to strike, or whether my apparent frailty would make their job easier. Every gesture, every word was part of an elaborate dance of deception that would soon reach its deadly climax. When we finally reached Eagle's Point, the view was indeed spectacular. The entire canyon spread below us like a map drawn by the gods, with the stream glinting silver in the afternoon sun and red rock walls painted in shades of rust and gold. "Perfect spot for photographs," Danny said, setting down his pack and beginning to arrange his equipment. Ma, Pa, why don't you stand right there by the edge? The lighting's ideal. The edge, of course, where a simple push would send us tumbling to our deaths on the rocks below. Sam and I moved to the position Danny indicated, our hands finding each other instinctively. To anyone watching, we looked like a devoted couple posing for anniversary photographs. In reality, we were two warriors preparing for the fight of our lives. Closer to the edge, Clara directed, her camera raised. We want to get the full canyon in the background. Another step closer to death, but also another step closer to the hidden ledge that represented our only hope of survival. Perfect, Danny said, and I heard something in his voice that made every nerve in my body scream with alarm. Now just hold that pose while Clara gets the shot. But instead of taking a photograph, Clara set down the camera and moved to flank us from the left while Danny approached from the right. The trap was springing, and there was nowhere to run. You know, Danny said conversationally, his mask finally slipping to reveal the cold calculation beneath. I've been thinking about Thomas a lot lately, about that night 5 years ago when he fell off this very cliff. My blood turned to ice, but I kept my expression neutral. What about Thomas? About how convenient his death was, how it left me as your only heir, your only surviving son. Danny's smile was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. I've been wondering if maybe it's time for another convenient accident. The moment of truth had arrived. In seconds, they would make their move, and Sam and I would have to execute our desperate plan perfectly or die in the attempt. But as I looked into my son's eyes and saw nothing but greed and murderous intent, I felt the spirits of my ancestors rise within me like a tide of righteous fury. Danny had forgotten one crucial fact about his mother. The blood of Comanche warriors flowed in my veins, and we had never learned to die quietly. You killed Thomas, I said quietly, my voice carrying across the canyon wind with the certainty of absolute truth. You murdered your own brother in cold blood, and now you plan to do the same to us. Danny's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. Took you long enough to figure it out, Ma. I was starting to think you'd go to your grave as stupid as you lived. The cruelty in his words hit me like a physical blow, but it also completed the transformation that had been building in my spirit for days. The last vestige of maternal love died in that moment, replaced by the cold fury of a Comanche warrior facing her enemies. Why, Sam asked, his voice hoarse with pain. We gave you everything, loved you, protected you even when we knew what you'd done. Why wasn't that enough? Clara stepped closer, her pretty face twisted with contempt. Because you were never going to give him what he really needed, control of this ranch, access to your money, the respect he deserved as your heir. Thomas was the heir, I said, understanding flooding through me. Thomas was the one you trusted with responsibility, the one who would have inherited everything. Danny was just the spare son, wasn't he? The spare son who was tired of being spare. Danny snarled. Do you have any idea what it was like? Growing up in Thomas's shadow, perfect Thomas. Honest Thomas. Responsible Thomas. Everyone loved Thomas. So you killed him for it. I killed him because he was going to destroy me. Danny's composure cracked completely, revealing the festering resentment beneath. He found out about the money I'd borrowed, the debts I owed. He was going to turn me over to the sheriff, ruin my life over a few $100s. A few $100s that you stole from your own family, Sam said. Money you would have given me if you'd ever treated me like a real son instead of a disappointment. Danny's face was flushed with rage and self-pity. But no, everything had to go through Thomas first. Thomas, the golden boy. Thomas, the perfect heir. Clara moved another step closer, and I could see the knife hidden in her hand. We tried to do this the easy way, she said with false sweetness. We tried to get you to sign over power of attorney, to make things simple and legal. But you had to be difficult. We had to be smart, I corrected. We knew what you were planning. Did you? Danny asked with genuine curiosity. Did you really know, or did you just suspect we knew you were thieves and murderers? Sam said, we knew you'd killed Thomas, and we knew you were planning to kill us too. Then why did you come? Clara asked, her knife now visible as she raised it slightly. Why walk into our trap if you knew what we intended? I smiled, feeling the spirits of my warrior ancestors flowing through me like fire in my veins, because sometimes the only way to catch a predator is to let it think it's caught you. Before either of them could react to my words, I grabbed Sam's hand and threw myself backward off the cliff, pulling him with me into the empty air above Devil's Canyon. For a heart-stopping moment, we fell freely through space, the wind rushing past us and the rocky bottom of the canyon rushing up to meet us. But I had counted on my childhood knowledge of this place, on the hidden ledge that my grandmother White Dove had shown me decades ago. We hit the narrow shelf of rock 30 feet down from the rim with jarring impact that drove the breath from our lungs and sent pain shooting through our bodies. But we were alive, hidden from view on a ledge that Danny and Clara couldn't see from above. "Are you hurt?" Sam whispered, his voice barely audible over the echo of our fall. "Bruised, but breathing," I replied, checking quickly for broken bones. My left shoulder ached fiercely, and Sam's face was scraped and bleeding. But we were both functional. Above us, I could hear Danny and Clara's voices, sharp with panic and confusion. "Where are their bodies?" Clara demanded. "They should have hit the bottom by now." "I don't know," Danny replied, his voice tight with frustration. "Maybe they got caught on an outcropping somewhere below us. We have to find them, make sure they're dead, if they survived." "They didn't survive a 200-foot fall," Danny said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Nobody could survive that. I pressed myself against the rock wall, making myself as invisible as possible while I listened to their conversation. This was the crucial moment. If they discovered we were still alive, our desperate gambit would fail and we'd be trapped on this ledge with nowhere to run. "Look. There." Clara's voice carried a note of relief. "I can see something red down there by the stream. That's your mother's dress." I looked down and saw what she was seeing, a piece of red cloth caught on a boulder far below, probably torn from some previous traveler's clothing. In their panic and from their high vantage point, it was easy to mistake it for evidence of our death. "Thank God," Danny said, and the genuine relief in his voice made my stomach turn. I was starting to think we'd have to climb down and search for them. "So what now?" Clara asked. We can't just leave them down there. Someone might find the bodies and ask questions." "We don't leave them," Danny replied, his voice taking on the calculating tone I'd learned to fear. "We go back to town and report a tragic accident. We were taking anniversary photographs when they got too close to the edge. A piece of loose rock gave way, and they fell before we could save them. And then we inherit everything. The ranch, the cattle, the savings, all of it. Enough to pay off my debts and start fresh somewhere else." "What about the search parties? Won't people want to recover the bodies?" Danny was quiet for a moment, thinking. "We'll say the fall was so severe that there's nothing left to recover. Happens sometimes in canyon accidents. Bodies get washed away by flash floods or scattered by animals." The cold calculation in his voice as he planned to cover up our supposed deaths was more chilling than his earlier rage. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a carefully planned murder for profit, with our son showing no more emotion than he would discussing the weather. "We should go," Clara said. "The longer we stay up here, the harder it'll be to act surprised and grieved when we report the accident. You're right. Help me pack the camera equipment. We need to make sure our story matches the evidence." I listened to the sounds of them gathering their belongings, their voices growing fainter as they moved away from the cliff edge. Soon, I could hear their horses' hoofbeats as they rode back toward town to report our deaths and claim their inheritance. Only when the canyon fell completely silent did Sam and I dare to speak normally. "Phase 1 complete," I said grimly. "They think we're dead." "Now comes the hard part," Sam replied, examining our precarious position. "Getting off this ledge and back to civilization before they realized their mistake." I looked down at the treacherous climb that awaited us, 60 feet of loose rock and narrow handholds leading to the canyon floor, then a difficult hike through rough terrain to reach help. It would be dangerous even for experienced climbers, and we were both injured and shaken from our fall, but we were alive when we should have been dead, and we had the advantage of surprise. Danny and Clara thought they had won, that they were finally free to claim the fruits of their betrayal. They had no idea that their victims were very much alive, and very determined to see justice done. The hardest part of our ordeal was just beginning, but so was our chance for revenge. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western rim of Devil's Canyon when Sam and I finally gathered the courage to attempt our escape from the hidden ledge. Every muscle in my body ached from our controlled fall, and my left shoulder throbbed with each movement. But staying put meant certain death when Danny and Clara realized we'd survived. "The old handholds are still there," I said, running my fingers along the rock face where generations of Comanche had carved shallow grips for climbing. "My grandmother showed me this path when I was 12 years old. She said it was an escape route for warriors who found themselves trapped on the canyon rim." Sam tested the first handhold, his weathered rancher's hands finding purchase on the ancient stone. Your grandmother was a wise woman. Let's hope her granddaughter inherited that wisdom. The descent was a nightmare of loose rock and aching muscles. Every few feet, we had to pause while I fought waves of dizziness and Sam dealt with the bleeding cuts on his face. The canyon wall seemed to stretch endlessly below us, and more than once I questioned whether we'd survive this escape attempt any better than we would have survived Danny's original plan. But my ancestors' spirits whispered encouragement with each careful step downward. I could feel White Dove's presence guiding my hands to the safest holds, her warrior's instincts helping me choose the most stable path through the treacherous rock face. Halfway down, disaster nearly struck when a section of sandstone crumbled under Sam's weight, sending him sliding several feet before he managed to arrest his fall. The sound of falling rocks echoed through the canyon like gunshots, and we both froze, listening for any sign that the noise might have attracted attention. "You all right?" I whispered when the echoes faded. "Scraped up, but still breathing," he replied, his voice tight with pain. "How much farther?" I looked down at the canyon floor, calculating the remaining distance. Maybe 20 feet. We're almost there. Those final 20 feet took another hour of careful climbing, but eventually our boots touched solid ground at the bottom of Devil's Canyon. The stream that had carved this magnificent gorge over countless centuries bubbled peacefully beside us, indifferent to the human drama that had played out on its rim. "Water," Sam said gratefully, kneeling beside the stream to drink and wash the blood from his face. "Never thought I'd be so happy to see the bottom of this place." I joined him at the water's edge, cupping the clear liquid in my hands and drinking deeply. The cold stream water tasted like life itself after our ordeal, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel a spark of hope that we might actually survive this nightmare. But survival meant more than just escaping the canyon. It meant gathering proof of what Danny and Clara had attempted, and it meant reaching help before they could settle themselves in as our grieving heirs. "Look there," I said, pointing to a section of the canyon wall where recent rockfall had left fresh scars. "That's where they thought we landed. If anyone comes looking, that's where they'll search for our bodies." Sam studied the debris field with his deputy's eye for signs and tracks. "Good. The longer it takes them to realize we're not dead, the more time we have to tell our story." As we began our trek downstream toward the canyon mouth, I kept my eyes open for anything that might serve as proof of their plan. Near a bend in the stream, I found what I was looking for, a piece of rope that Danny had dropped during his preparations, still bearing the distinctive knots he'd learned during his failed prospecting days. "This shows he planned the whole thing," I said, coiling the rope carefully and tucking it inside my jacket. No one brings climbing rope to a simple photography session. We also found signs of Danny's earlier scouting trips, boot prints in the mud that matched his distinctive hand-tooled boots, and the cold ashes of a small fire where he'd probably camped while planning our murder. Each piece was another mark against him when we told our story. The hike out of Devil's Canyon took 3 hours of hard walking over rough terrain. My injured shoulder made every step agony, and Sam's cuts had reopened and were bleeding again. But we pushed forward with the determination of people who knew their lives depended on reaching civilization. As the canyon walls gradually lowered and the terrain became more familiar, I began to recognize landmarks from my childhood explorations. The twisted oak tree where I'd carved my initials at age 10, the rock formation that looked like a sleeping buffalo, the spring where my mother had taught me to gather medicinal herbs. "We're almost to the Henderson place," I told Sam as we crested a low hill. "Another mile, and we'll be able to get help." The Henderson Ranch sat in a valley below us, smoke rising from the chimney and lamplight glowing in the windows as the family prepared for evening. It was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen, proof that we'd survived Danny's attempt to murder us and live to seek justice. But as we approached the ranch house, I realized that our ordeal was far from over. Convincing people that we'd survived a fall from Devil's Canyon would be difficult enough. Proving that our own son had tried to kill us would be nearly impossible without more proof than we currently possessed. "Martha," I called out as we stumbled into the yard. "Martha Henderson, it's Rebecca Whitehorse. We need help." The front door flew open and Martha Henderson emerged, her face a mask of shock and confusion. "Rebecca, Sam. My God. What happened to you? You look like you've been dragged through hell." "We have been," Sam said grimly. "Martha, we need to get word to Sheriff Morrison immediately, and we need to send someone to town to find out what Danny and Clara are telling people about us." Martha's husband, John, appeared behind her, his weathered rancher's face creasing with concern as he took in our battered appearance. Come inside, both of you. Martha, get the medical kit. John Jr., ride to town and fetch the sheriff. As Martha tended to our wounds and John Jr. saddled his fastest horse for the ride to Cedar Creek. I tried to gather my words for the talk with Sheriff Morrison that would decide whether justice was finally done, or whether Danny and Clara would succeed in claiming our inheritance through murder. Rebecca, Martha said as she cleaned the cuts on my face. People are going to find this hard to believe. Your own son trying to kill you, it's almost too terrible to imagine. I know, I replied. But we have proof, and we have the truth. Sometimes that has to be enough. Through the window, I could see the lights of Cedar Creek twinkling in the distance. Somewhere in that town, Danny and Clara were probably playing the roles of grieving family members, accepting condolences for our tragic deaths and making plans to claim our property. They had no idea that their victims were alive, armed with signs of their crimes, and determined to see justice done. The surprise was our greatest weapon now, and I intended to use it to its fullest advantage. The final confrontation was still ahead of us. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt confident that we would emerge victorious. The spirits of my ancestors had guided us this far, and they would not abandon us now when justice was finally within reach. Sheriff Jake Morrison arrived at the Henderson Ranch just after midnight, his horse lathered with sweat from the hard ride and his weathered face grim with disbelief. John Jr. had done his job well, rousing the lawman from his bed with news that would shake Cedar Creek to its foundations. Rebecca, Sam, the sheriff said as he dismounted, removing his hat with the respect due to people he'd believed were dead. When young Henderson told me you were alive, I thought he'd been drinking. The whole town's talking about your tragic accident at Devil's Canyon. What exactly are they saying? I asked. Accepting the cup of coffee, Martha pressed into my hands. The warmth felt good against my bruised fingers, and the bitter liquid helped clear the fog of exhaustion from my mind. Sheriff Morrison settled into a chair across from us, his keen eyes taking in our battered appearance and the makeshift bandages Martha had applied to our wounds. According to Danny and Clara, you folks were taking anniversary photographs when the cliff edge gave way. They say they tried to save you but couldn't reach you in time, and people believed them. Why wouldn't they? Morrison replied. Devil's Canyon's claimed lives before. Loose rock, sudden winds, accidents happen. Nobody had reason to suspect foul play, especially not from family. Sam leaned forward, his voice hoarse but determined. Jake, what we're about to tell you will sound impossible, but every word is true. Our son Danny murdered his brother Thomas 5 years ago, and today he tried to murder us too. The sheriff's expression didn't change, but I saw his hand move unconsciously toward the notebook he always carried. Jake Morrison had been keeping the peace in this territory for 15 years, and he'd learned to listen to wild stories with an open mind. Start from the beginning, he said simply. Tell me everything. For the next hour, Sam and I laid out the whole terrible tale. Thomas's discovery of Danny's theft, the confrontation at Devil's Canyon, Sam's agonizing decision to help cover up the murder, the years of continued stealing that followed. We told him about Danny's gambling debts, the threats from his creditors, and the elaborate plan to eliminate us and claim our inheritance. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but never showing skepticism or disbelief. When we finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what we'd revealed. That's quite a story, he said finally. You have any proof to back it up? I pulled the rope from inside my jacket, setting it on the table between us. Danny dropped this during his preparations. Look at the knots. They're the same style he learned during his prospecting days. No photographer needs climbing rope for taking pictures. The sheriff examined the rope carefully now, testing the knots with his fingers. These are prospectors' knots. All right. What else? Sam described the boot prints and fire ashes we'd found in the canyon, evidence that Danny had scouted the location multiple times. I told Morrison about the silver jewelry Carlos Mendez had mentioned at the market, and the forged bank documents that had come to light. There's more, I said, remembering something crucial. Before we left for the canyon, I wrote out a full confession and left it with the bank president, sealed with instructions to open it if we didn't return by Monday. Morrison nodded approvingly. Smart thinking. That letter will carry weight in court, especially since it was written before the alleged accident. He paused, Rasmus studying our faces in the lamplight. But I have to ask, why didn't you come to me sooner? Why wait 5 years to report Thomas's murder? Sam's shoulders sagged with the weight of guilt he'd carried for so long. Because I was a fool. Jake, because I thought I was protecting my family by covering up the truth. I made a terrible choice. And it's haunted me every day since. Sam helped cover up the original crime, I added. If he'd come forward, he'd have faced charges as an accessory. We were trapped by our own silence. The sheriff was quiet again, weighing our words against his knowledge of our character. Finally, he spoke. I've known you folks for 20 years. You're good people, honest people. If you say Danny killed Thomas, I believe you. The question now is what we do about it. What do you mean? I asked. I mean that right now. Danny and Clara think they've gotten away with murder. They're probably at home making plans for your funeral and figuring out how to claim your property. That gives us an advantage. Morrison stood up, pacing to the window where he could see the lights of Cedar Creek in the distance. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ride back to town and act like nothing's changed. Let them think their plan worked. Meanwhile, I'll quietly gather more proof, talk to Carlos about that jewelry, examine the bank records, maybe have a word with those creditors who came looking for Danny. And then, Sam asked, then we spring the trap. Nothing shakes a guilty man's composure like seeing his victims walk back from the dead. The plan Morrison outlined was simple but effective. He would return to town and begin a discreet investigation while maintaining the fiction that we were dead. Meanwhile, we would remain hidden at the Henderson Ranch, recovering from our injuries and preparing for the confrontation to come. How long do you think it'll take? I asked. Give me 3 days. Morrison replied. 3 days to build an airtight case against them. Then we'll arrange a little surprise reunion. As the sheriff prepared to leave, he turned back to us with a serious expression. Rebecca, Sam, I want you to understand something. What Danny did, murdering his brother, trying to kill his parents, it's going to shock this whole community. People are going to have trouble believing it, even with all the proof in the world. We know, I said quietly. But the truth has to come out. Thomas deserves justice, and other families deserve to be protected from what Danny might do next. Morrison nodded grimly. You're right, and I give you my word, we'll see justice done, no matter how painful it might be. After the sheriff rode away, Martha insisted we rest in her guest room, but sleep was impossible. My mind kept racing over the events of the day, the narrow escape from death, and the confrontation that lay ahead. Do you think Morrison can build a strong enough case? Sam asked as we lay in the darkness. I think Jake Morrison is a good lawman who's seen enough evil to recognize it when it stares him in the face. I replied. And I think Danny's about to learn that murdering your family isn't as easy as he thought. Through the window, I could see the first faint light of dawn touching the eastern horizon, somewhere in Cedar Creek. My son was probably sleeping peacefully, confident that he'd finally eliminated the obstacles to his inheritance. In 3 days, he would discover just how wrong he was. The dead would rise to accuse him, and justice, long delayed but not denied, would finally have its day. The spirits of my ancestors whispered approval on the morning wind, and I knew that Thomas would soon be able to rest in peace. The second day of our supposed death brought visitors to the Henderson Ranch, neighbors and friends who'd heard whispered rumors that Sam and I might still be alive. Word travels fast in frontier communities, and despite Sheriff Morrison's attempts at secrecy, people had begun to notice his unusual activities around town. Rebecca Whitehorse. As I live and breathe, exclaimed Reverend Patterson as Martha ushered him into the parlor where I sat mending my torn dress. The whole territory's been talking about your tragic accident, and here you are, alive and well. Not entirely well, I replied, gesturing to the bandages that still covered my cuts and bruises. But alive, thanks to God's grace and a bit of Comanche climbing knowledge. The Reverend's eyes widened as I told him a carefully edited version of our escape from Devil's Canyon. I left out the murder attempt and Danny's involvement, sticking to the story that Sheriff Morrison and I had agreed upon, that we'd survived a genuine accident through luck and frontier skills. Remarkable, Reverend Patterson murmured. Simply remarkable. But tell me, why haven't you returned to town? Surely Danny and Clara are beside themselves with worry. We're not quite ready for that reunion, I said carefully. We need a few more days to recover from our injuries before we can travel safely. The Reverend nodded understandingly, but I could see questions in his eyes. He was a perceptive man who'd counseled troubled families for decades, and something about our situation didn't sit right with him. After he left, Martha brought me a cup of tea and settled into the chair beside me. Rebecca, people are starting to ask questions. How long can you and Sam stay hidden here before someone figures out what's really going on? Sheriff Morrison said 3 days, I replied. We just need to hold out until he's gathered enough proof to make arrests. And what if Danny and Clara get suspicious in the meantime? What if they start wondering why their victims haven't been found? It was a valid concern, one that had been keeping me awake at night. Danny was cunning and paranoid. If he started to suspect we'd survived, he might flee before justice could be served. That afternoon, John Henderson returned from town with news that made my blood run cold. I stopped by the general store, he reported, and folks are saying Danny and Clara have been asking a lot of questions about when search parties might be organized to recover your bodies. What kind of questions? Sam asked, his deputy's instincts aroused. Practical ones, mostly. How long before the canyon floods make searching impossible? Whether anyone's planning to bring dogs to track scents, that sort of thing. I exchanged a worried glance with Sam. Danny wasn't just playing the grieving son. He was actively monitoring efforts to find our remains. If a search party actually went to Devil's Canyon and failed to find bodies, it wouldn't take him long to realize we'd escaped. There's more, John continued. I overheard Clara talking to the banker's wife about funeral arrangements. She's already picked out plots in the cemetery and started planning a memorial service. The callousness of it took my breath away. My son's wife was planning our funeral while we were still alive, probably calculating how quickly she could claim our property once we were officially declared dead. That evening, Sheriff Morrison arrived with an update on his investigation. His weathered face was grim as he settled into the Hendersons' kitchen, accepting a cup of coffee with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion. I've been busy, he said without preamble. Talked to Carlos Mendez about that silver jewelry. He confirmed Danny tried to sell pieces that were far too valuable for a failed prospector to own. Also spoke with the bank president about those forged documents. The handwriting's a close match to Danny's signature on other papers. What about the creditors? I asked. That's where it gets interesting, Morrison replied. Turns out Danny owes even more than you thought, nearly $2,000 to some very dangerous men from San Antonio. They've been pressuring him for payment. And word is they gave him until the end of this week to settle his debts. $2,000. More than our ranch made in 3 good years. The scope of Danny's desperation was even greater than we'd realized. There's something else, the sheriff continued. I've been watching Danny and Clara discreetly, and their behaviors. Odd for grieving family members. Yesterday, I saw Clara at the dress shop, ordering new clothes. Not morning clothes, fancy dresses like she was planning to celebrate something. Sam's jaw tightened with anger. They're already spending our inheritance in their minds. Gets worse, Morrison said. This morning, Danny visited the land office, asking questions about how quickly property transfers can be processed after a death. The clerk told him it usually takes months, but Danny seemed mighty interested in ways to speed up the process. Every new detail painted a clearer picture of their cold calculation. This wasn't grief. It was barely concealed excitement as they prepared to claim the fruits of their murderous plot. Jake, I said quietly, we need to end this soon. If they get suspicious, or if those creditors get impatient. I know, the sheriff replied, which is why I'm moving up our timeline. Tomorrow night. We're going to arrange that surprise reunion I mentioned. He outlined his plan as we listened with growing satisfaction. Danny and Clara would be invited to a private meeting at the sheriff's office, ostensibly to discuss the search for our bodies. When they arrived, they'd find us waiting, very much alive and ready to confront them with their crimes. What about the rest of the town? Sam asked, P.E. People are going to want answers about why we've been hiding. We'll tell them the truth, Morrison replied. That you survived an accident but discovered evidence that it wasn't really an accident at all. That you needed time to investigate before revealing yourselves. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was close enough to satisfy most people's curiosity without revealing the full scope of Sam's complicity in Thomas's death. As the sheriff prepared to leave, he turned back to us with a serious expression. Rebecca, Sam, I want you to be prepared for tomorrow night. Danny and Clara are going to be desperate when they realize their plan failed. Desperate people do dangerous things. We'll be ready, I assured him, feeling the familiar stirring of my warrior ancestors' spirits. We've survived this long. We can survive one more confrontation. After Morrison rode away, Sam and I sat on the Hendersons' porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear Texas sky. Tomorrow night would bring the final reckoning, the moment when justice would finally be served for Thomas's murder and our own attempted killing. Are you afraid? Sam asked quietly. No, I replied, surprising myself with the truth of it. I'm angry. I'm heartbroken. But I'm not afraid. Danny and Clara had their chance to kill us, and they failed. Tomorrow, they'll learn what happens when you underestimate a mother's love and a warrior's determination. In the distance, a coyote howled, and I heard in that sound the voices of my ancestors calling for justice. Tomorrow night, their calls would finally be answered. The next evening, as shadows lengthened across Cedar Creek's main street, Sam and I made our way to the sheriff's office through the back alleys, avoiding the curious eyes of townspeople who still believed us dead. My hands trembled slightly as we approached the building where justice would finally be served. But my heart was steady with the certainty that this long nightmare was about to end. Sheriff Morrison met us at the rear entrance, his weathered face grim with purpose. "They'll be here any minute," he said quietly. "I sent word that I needed to discuss the search efforts with them privately. They think they're coming to help plan the recovery of your bodies." "Are you ready for this?" Sam asked me, his calloused hand finding mine in the darkness. "I've been ready for 5 years," I replied, feeling the spirits of my warrior ancestors gathering around me like invisible armor. We positioned ourselves in the sheriff's private office, hidden behind a curtain that divided the room. Through the thin fabric, we could see Morrison's desk and the 2 chairs where Danny and Clara would sit, unknowing that their victims were watching from mere feet away. The sound of horses approaching made my pulse quicken. Through the window, I saw Danny and Clara dismounting, their movements casual and unhurried. They looked like any other young couple in town for an evening meeting, Danny in his best shirt and vest, Clara wearing a dark blue dress that was far too fine for a grieving widow. "Evening, Sheriff," Danny's voice carried clearly as they entered the office. "Got your message about the search. Any word on when we might be able to recover Ma and Pa's remains?" "That's what I wanted to discuss," Morrison replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Please, have a seat." "Shaku Shin, Mom." I watched through the curtain as my son and his wife settled into the chairs, their faces composed in expressions of appropriate sorrow. Clara dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, while Danny leaned forward with the earnest concern of a devoted son. "Sheriff, I hope you understand how difficult this is for us," Clara said, her voice trembling with perfectly feigned emotion. "Not knowing exactly what happened, not being able to give them a proper burial, it's almost unbearable." "I can imagine," Morrison said dryly. "Tell me, Danny, in your own words, what happened at Devil's Canyon?" Danny launched into his rehearsed story with the smooth confidence of a practiced liar. He described the photography session, the loose rock that gave way under our feet, his desperate but futile attempts to save us. Every word was delivered with convincing emotion, every detail calculated to support the fiction of tragic accident. "We tried so hard to reach them," he concluded, his voice breaking slightly, "but the drop was too steep, and they fell so far. There was nothing we could do." "Nothing at all?" Morrison asked quietly. "Nothing," Clara confirmed, squeezing Danny's hand in a gesture of mutual support. "We called and called, but there was no answer. We knew they must be—" She let the words trail off, unable to speak of our supposed death. The performance was flawless, and if I hadn't known the truth, I might have been moved by their apparent grief. "That's interesting," the sheriff said, opening a folder on his desk, "because I've been investigating your story, and I found some curious things." Danny's expression didn't change, but I saw his shoulders tense slightly. "What kind of things?" "Well, for instance, this rope." Morrison pulled out the evidence we'd found in the canyon. "Funny thing to bring on a photography expedition. Don't you think I always carry rope when we go hiking?" Danny replied smoothly. "Safety precaution. Wish I'd been able to use it to help Ma and Pa." "And this?" The sheriff produced a piece of paper. "Bank records showing you've been forging your parents' signatures on loan applications." Now Danny's composure cracked slightly, a flush of color rising in his cheeks. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Or this testimony from Carlos Mendez about silver jewelry you tried to sell. Jewelry far too valuable for a failed prospector to own, honestly." Clara shifted nervously in her chair, her handkerchief forgotten as she realized the trap closing around them. "Sheriff, I don't understand what this has to do with the accident." "Because it wasn't an accident," Morrison interrupted, his voice hard as iron. "It was attempted murder, and I have witnesses to prove it." "Witnesses?" Danny's voice cracked slightly. "That's impossible. There was nobody else at the canyon." "Wasn't there?" Morrison asked quietly. That was our cue. Sam and I stepped out from behind the curtain, and I will never forget the expression of absolute horror that crossed Danny's face when he saw us. It was as if he'd seen ghosts risen from the grave, which, in a sense, he had. "Hello, son," I said quietly, my voice carrying all the pain and betrayal of the past 5 years. "Surprised to see us," Clara screamed. A high, piercing sound that seemed to echo off the office walls. She fell back in her chair as if she'd been struck, her face white as bleached bone. Danny's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, no sound emerging. For a long moment, the office was silent except for Clara's ragged breathing and the ticking of the clock on Morrison's wall. "You're dead," Danny finally whispered. "I saw you fall. You're both dead." "No, son," Sam said sadly. "We're very much alive. But Thomas is dead. Isn't he dead by your hand? Just like you tried to kill us." At the mention of his brother's name, something broke in Danny's composure. The mask he'd worn for 5 years finally cracked completely, revealing the desperate, murderous man beneath. "Thomas was going to destroy me," he snarled, lunging to his feet. "He was going to turn me over to the law, ruin my life over a few stolen dollars. I had no choice." "You had a choice," I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my cheeks. "You could have confessed, made restitution, asked for forgiveness. Instead, you chose murder. And when that wasn't enough," Sam added, "you chose to try to murder us too." Clara had recovered enough to speak, her voice shrill with panic. "It was all Danny's idea. I never wanted to hurt anyone. He forced me to help him." "Shut up!" Danny whirled on her, his face twisted with rage. "You were the one who said we needed to get rid of them before the creditors came calling. You planned the whole canyon trip." "I was trying to save us," Clara shot back. "You're the one who got us into debt with your gambling. You're the one who killed Thomas." Sheriff Morrison had heard enough. "Daniel Whitehorse, Clara Whitehorse. You're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Whitehorse and the attempted murder of Rebecca and Samuel Whitehorse." As the handcuffs clicked into place around my son's wrists, I felt a weight lift from my chest that I'd been carrying for 5 years. Justice was finally being served, not just for our attempted murder, but for Thomas's death as well. "Ma," Danny said as Morrison led him toward the door, his voice suddenly young and pleading. "Ma, please, I'm still your son." I looked into his eyes that had once been bright with childhood innocence, and saw nothing there but the cold calculation of a killer. "No," I said quietly. "My son died the night he murdered his brother. You're just a stranger wearing his face." As they were led away to the jail, Clara still protesting her innocence and Danny finally silent with defeat, I felt the presence of my ancestors settling around me like a warm embrace. The spirits whispered approval on the evening wind, and somewhere in that sound, I heard Thomas's voice offering forgiveness and gratitude. Justice had taken 5 years to arrive, but it had arrived at last. The dead could finally rest in peace, and the living could begin to heal from the wounds of betrayal and loss. 3 months later, I stood in the cemetery at Cedar Creek, placing wildflowers on Thomas's grave while the autumn wind whispered through the cottonwood trees. The headstone was new, carved with words that finally told the truth. Thomas Whitehorse, beloved son and brother, murdered 1878, justice served 1883. The trial had been the talk of the territory for weeks. People came from as far as San Antonio to hear the testimony about a son who'd killed his brother and tried to murder his parents for money. The evidence was overwhelming. The rope, the forged documents, the silver jewelry, and most damning of all, Danny and Clara's own confessions in Sheriff Morrison's office. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Danny was sentenced to hang for Thomas's murder, while Clara received 20 years in the territorial prison for her role in both crimes. Justice, long delayed, had finally been served with the swift certainty that frontier law demanded. "Ma," a small voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned to see little Sarah Henderson, Martha's youngest daughter, approaching with shy steps. "Ma says to tell you that dinner's ready, and you're expected at our table." I smiled at the child, remembering how the community had rallied around Sam and me in the weeks following the trial. The Hendersons had insisted we stay with them while we decided what to do with the ranch, and neighbors had taken turns helping with the cattle and crops we'd been too shaken to manage ourselves. "Tell your mother I'll be along directly," I said, giving Sarah a gentle pat on the head. "Just need another minute here." After the child skipped away, I knelt beside Thomas's grave and placed my hand on the cool stone. "It's finished, son," I whispered in both English and Comanche. "Danny and Clara will pay for what they did to you and to us. You can rest now." The wind through the trees seemed to carry a whisper of gratitude, and for a moment, I felt Thomas's presence as clearly as if he were standing beside me. Then the feeling faded, leaving behind a sense of peace I hadn't known in 5 years. Walking back toward the Henderson Ranch, I reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day at Devil's Canyon. The community's initial shock at learning the truth about Danny had given way to an outpouring of support for Sam and me. People who'd known us for decades rallied to our defense, offering everything from meals to help with ranch work to simple words of comfort. Reverend Patterson had preached a powerful sermon about the dangers of greed and the importance of family loyalty, using our story as a cautionary tale without dwelling on the more painful details. The town had learned to see us not as victims to be pitied, but as survivors who'd fought for justice and won. Sam was waiting for me on the Hendersons' front porch, his face more peaceful than I'd seen it since Thomas's death. The guilt that had haunted him for 5 years was finally lifting, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd helped bring his son's killer to justice. "How are you feeling?" he asked as I settled into the chair beside him. "Like I can finally breathe again," I replied honestly, "for the first time in 5 years. I don't wake up wondering if today will be the day Danny's crimes are discovered. The truth is out. Justice is served, and we can start thinking about the future instead of hiding from the past." "Speaking of the future," Sam said, "I had an interesting conversation with Sheriff Morrison today. He's thinking about retiring next year, and he suggested I might consider running for his position." I considered this surprising development. Sam had served as deputy sheriff for years, and his handling of our case had earned him respect throughout the territory. He had the experience and the temperament for the job, and at 63, he was still young enough to serve effectively. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think it might be time for a change," he replied. "The ranch holds too many painful memories now. Maybe it's time to sell it and start fresh in town." The idea had merit. Our ranch would always be the place where Thomas had lived and worked, where Danny had planned his crimes, where our family had been torn apart by greed and betrayal. Starting over in Cedar Creek, where Sam could serve the community as sheriff and I could continue my healing work, might be exactly what we needed. "There's something else," Sam continued. "Chief Running Bear came by this afternoon while you were at the cemetery. He wanted to speak with you about a ceremony." My uncle had been a source of strength throughout the ordeal, offering spiritual guidance and helping me understand how the old ways could coexist with frontier justice. "What kind of ceremony?" "A healing ritual for the family," Sam explained. "He says the spirits have been telling him that Thomas's death created a wound in the spiritual fabric of our bloodline. Now that justice has been served, that wound can finally heal, but it requires proper ceremony." The idea appealed to me deeply. My Comanche heritage had sustained me through the darkest moments of this ordeal, and it seemed fitting that the old ways should help us find closure and peace. That evening, as we sat around the Hendersons' dinner table sharing a meal with people who'd become like family to us, I felt a contentment I hadn't experienced in years. The food was simple but nourishing, the conversation warm and supportive, and the sense of community strong enough to heal even the deepest wounds. "Rebecca," Martha said as we cleared the dishes, "I hope you know how much your strength has meant to all of us. Watching you fight for justice, seeing you refuse to let evil triumph, it's reminded us all what courage looks like." "I had help," I replied, thinking of my warrior ancestors whose spirits had guided me through the darkest hours. Nobody faces trials like this alone, not if they're wise enough to accept the support that's offered. Later that night, as Sam and I prepared for bed in the guest room that had become our temporary home, I looked out the window toward Devil's Canyon. The place that had nearly been our grave now seemed less threatening, just another feature of the landscape we'd called home for so many years. "Do you think we'll ever be able to forgive him?" Sam asked quietly, following my gaze toward the canyon. "Danny." I considered the question carefully. I don't know if forgiveness is possible for what he did to Thomas, or what he tried to do to us, but I think we can find peace with it. We can choose to let the anger go, not for his sake, but for our own. And Clara. Clara was a fool who let greed override her conscience, but she wasn't the killer. If she serves her time and finds genuine repentance, maybe there's hope for her yet. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt the presence of my ancestors settling around me like a warm blanket. The spirits whispered approval for the justice we'd achieved and the healing we'd begun. Thomas's murder had been avenged. Our family's honor had been restored, and the future stretched ahead of us bright with possibility. Frontier justice had been served, and with it came the promise of a new beginning built on truth instead of lies, healing instead of hatred, and hope instead of fear. As I write these words 5 years later, sitting on the porch of the sheriff's house in Cedar Creek, I can see Devil's Canyon in the distance, no longer a place of terror, but simply part of the landscape that shaped our family's story. Sam serves this community with honor as sheriff, and I continue my healing work, helping other families navigate their own trials with the wisdom earned through surviving our darkest hour. The ranch was sold to a young family from back east, people who see only the beauty of the land without knowing its painful history. Sometimes I ride out there and watch their children playing in the yard where Thomas once worked, and I'm glad that laughter has returned to that place. Chief Running Bear performed the healing ceremony he'd promised, and the spiritual wound in our family bloodline has finally closed. The ancestors rest peacefully now. Their warrior spirits no longer needed to guide us through battles we can fight ourselves. Danny was hanged on a cold February morning, and Clara serves her sentence in the territorial prison. I pray for her redemption, though I cannot forget her crimes. Forgiveness, I've learned, is not about forgetting the past. It's about choosing not to let that past poison your future. To any woman reading this who faces betrayal from her own blood, remember you are stronger than you know. The spirits of those who came before you carry wisdom and courage that no earthly trial can destroy. Trust in that strength. Fight for justice, and never let evil triumph simply because it wears a familiar face. Some battles are worth fighting. No matter the cost, justice may come slowly to the frontier, but it comes surely to those brave enough to demand it.